Welcome to Let the Boys Kiss, the creation of queer ships, where we ask the question, is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon?
This week, we'll be discussing Steve and Danny from the CBS reboot of Hawaii Five-0. I'm Maddie.
And I'm Kelsey.
So Hawaii Five-0. How have we found ourselves in this situation? Not really a show a lot of people our age are watching, unless they're in the shipping community, because that is how I found out about it.
Okay.
I will say I'm the reason we're doing this episode. Kelsey had not seen it before we prepared for this.
Yes, this is another one of our classic, Maddie gives me a handful of episodes to watch, and I try to piece things together.
So this series, as I said, I found out about because of Tumblr. It's one of those things where you're hanging out on Tumblr, you're looking at your whatever you're normally looking at, and then someone you follow all of a sudden is posting GIF sets of like some new relationship you've never seen before, and you're like, what in the world is this? It's a CBS police procedural. I must watch it. How much of this show have you seen?
So you had me watch 10 episodes, which this is a long-running show. The show is 10 seasons, so proportionally not a lot of the show.
I have seen more than that, though I have not seen all of it. I've seen probably the majority of the first 6 or 7 seasons, something. It becomes fuzzy to me because there are actor changes that we will talk about a little bit more later. I've seen a fair amount of the show. I have not seen all 10 seasons. And I, like you, had to watch the series finale basically out of context of anything that happened. So we're both piecing that together. But I guess let's talk a little bit about the history of the relationship in the show and just go over a not small sample of like moments and plot lines that support the ship.
Right. I think it's worth saying, because this is a procedural, moments are spiced into a lot of the episodes, which is fine. But yeah, makes creating a watch list for me difficult because you might have an episode. Yes, there's this great small moment, but is it worth me watching the whole episode for that?
And what I wish there had been, but I was not able to find, were like really good moment compilations for the two of them. I think that the fandom is like maybe just not big enough for that or something. But yeah, their relationship is comprised mainly of fun moments. But then I couldn't find good sets of that. So I gave you episodes that focused heavily on their relationship. But what we found through discussion of it is that meant you kind of didn't get a good sense of their normal dynamic of the show, because a lot of the episodes that are focused heavily on their relationship, they're kind of not even doing casework. It's like the two of them will go off somewhere together, and then the rest of the people who work for Five-0 are handling a case, and the two of them are just on vacation together.
Yeah, the sample of the show I saw, they don't seem to do much police work, and it's Daniel Day Kim and Grace Park who are doing everything because they're on vacation or trapped in a building or something else.
I guess I'll give a teeny bit of like the premise of the show. The pilot episode is like, Steve is a Navy SEAL. He is working some sort of secret case where they have this guy in custody, and then that guy's brother basically kidnaps his father, calls to try to get his own brother released. Things go south. The brother dies. He kills Steve's father. Steve has to come back to Hawaii, which is where he grew up, to sort of deal with his dead father and trying to find the guy who killed him. And while he's there, the governor of Hawaii decides to tempt him away from the SEALs to start a new task force on the island called Hawaii Five-0. And basically she offers him, she calls it immunity and means, but basically the premise is, well, you should start a cop group where you can do literally anything you want and you won't get in trouble for it.
Right.
It's like dark times when you think about where we are in the world.
I was saying to you, like, I enjoyed the elements of their relationship for sure, but I was not happy with how often they were punching people they were holding.
They violate people's civil rights every episode multiple times.
And I was also very troubled by the fact that their interrogation room didn't have a table. It was weird.
It's just a chair, like, chained to the floor.
It makes it easier for them to punch the guy.
Exactly. It's harder to punch when you have to go around a table.
Yeah, it was troubling to watch.
But anyway, so he's on Hawaii. He starts this task force. He's investigating his dad's death. The cop from the Hawaii PD who's in charge of investigating the dad's death is Danny Williams, who is a transplant from New Jersey. He has moved to Hawaii because his ex-wife moved here with her new husband and brought their daughter with her. So he moved to be close to her. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as they meet, they hate each other immediately. Classic enemies to friends to lovers situation on this show. And Steve decides, since he has the power of the governor on his side, that he's just going to steal Danny from the Hawaii Police Department, make him his partner, and he's forced to work the case with him. And Danny hates it. So anyway, they sort of needle each other back and forth. Steve gets Danny shot, basically, on their first day together. Danny's really pissed about it. Steve's like, I don't understand why you're mad, because he's Steve. But eventually, you know, they find common ground. They work well together. They're both really smart, and they care about their jobs, and it works out.
Yeah.
So I could have done this labor myself, but I decided to rely on the wonderful internet, and we found this incredible Tumblr post by Tumblr user Five-0, where they have listed, just off the top of their head, tons and tons of like plot lines and moments that happen on the show. So I've sorted them a little bit. So in this category that I'm calling saving each other, here are some things that happen. Danny goes to jail and almost dies in Colombia to keep Steve from getting arrested. So Steve rescues him. Steve gets kidnapped seemingly almost all the time. He goes to North Korea on his own secret mission and gets kidnapped. So Danny has to bring the team to North Korea to rescue him. It's very dramatic. He, again, is off on his own case, gets kidnapped and almost dies in Afghanistan. So Danny has to go to Afghanistan. Steve gets kidnapped and almost dies in Hawaii. Danny rescues him. But anyway, they're kidnapped and rescued by each other constantly. In a similar vein, what I'm calling near-death experiences. There's a thing where Danny almost dies, has this hallucinated future. This is a theme on this show, by the way. There are a ton of episodes where one of them either hallucinates or dreams, or where they're imagining their future. And of course, their future is always together. There's a time when they both almost die under a collapsed building. And Steve tells Danny that he loves him for the first time. And then when they get out from under the collapsed building, Danny's girlfriend and daughter are there. And he says to them, no joke, can I get a moment with Steve? They go away. And he tells Steve that he loves him in return. There's a time when they're on this boat and they've been, I think, poisoned. It's hard to keep track of all of it. They're both going to die of this poison unless someone comes to rescue them in time with the antidote or whatever. And they are just sort of sitting together. And this is also a thing that happens a lot on the show. They're probably about to die. One of them says to the other something like, Danny, I got to tell you something. Or like, I just want to say, like, they want to have this goodbye, you know, moment. And then the other one will be like, no, like, don't say anything. Cause you know, that means we're actually going to die. Like that sort of thing.
Right.
That sort of stuff happens all the time when they're in near-death situations. In a category I'm calling Danny worries about Steve. Steve gets mortally wounded. They get shot when they're flying this plane and he almost dies. Danny has to land the plane, which he's never flown a plane before. They get Steve to the hospital. Turns out Steve needs a liver and Danny happens to be his match. And Danny immediately is like, let's not waste time testing people. I'm a match. Take my liver. So, of course, the two of them are bonded forever because they're sharing a liver. Steve has all these health issues later on in the show, and it gets to a point where Danny is really worried about his health and the fact that it doesn't seem like Steve is taking his health seriously. So there's this episode where he organizes an intervention and hires a stress counselor to come follow them around for a day, and she ends up deciding that a lot of Steve's stress comes from Danny because they bicker so much. And Danny starts to not argue with him about stuff he would normally argue with him about. And then at the end, Steve pulls him aside to be like, don't ever change, Dano. I love you the way you are. We have a bunch of more domestic type moments that fuel the McDanno shipping. My first category I'm calling mistaken for a couple. This is a thing that happens to them all the time for many reasons. First of all, Steve is often called babe by Danny and then occasionally will return it. They also say they love each other all the time. Once they, you know, break the seal in the collapsing building episode and have each said they love each other, it's not a thing that goes away. They say it all the time. They say it like in passing. They'll have some little bickery argument and then they turn and walk away from each other and one of them's like, love you too, babe. So that's near constant, the I love yous. Also something that they do all the time is they cuddle on the couch together. They're always sitting right up against each other when they're gonna like watch a movie or something, and Steve puts his arm around Danny, and both times that Steve is putting his arm around Danny, his girlfriend is on the couch with them.
I didn't realize that.
So there's one where Catherine, who we'll talk about later, is there, and it's Steve and Catherine and Danny's daughter. And the way that they sit on the couch is Catherine sits on one end next to Danny's daughter. Steve sits on the other end with his arm around Danny. And then we'll reblog this on Tumblr, but we found a great GIF set of them actually being mistaken for a couple, or at least like joked about. So there's all the time the two of them will be bickering on a case, and then like either someone they work with or even a criminal is like, how long you guys been married? Just like, that's a recurring joke for them. There's one where Steve's talking to Danny on the phone while he's doing some business, and the guy that he's with is like, you talking to your wife? And he's like, no, I'm talking to my partner. I'm sure he assumed that meant
his romantic partner. Yeah.
In another section I'm calling, somewhat facetiously, dates.
Mm-hmm.
The two of them often find themselves in these situations where they're hanging out on their own, doing something for fun, just because they like to hang out together. And then magically crimes happen. And so the work is drawn into it. More date-like dates are the one where they end up doing the couples therapy for the whole weekend. There's one where they each have girlfriends. It's Valentine's Day. Their girlfriends have planned special Valentine's Day dates for them. But of course, they're in cahoots and have planned for them all to be in these adjoining suites at the same hotel. But of course, Danny goes crazy, finds this child that he hates at the resort, and is convinced the kid has stolen his sunglasses, and spends the entire episode dragging Steve into his attempt to investigate this child's theft of his sunglasses.
I don't even know if he's dragging Steve so much as he goes off and Steve is like, I gotta be with Danny and deal with him.
Danny is like avoiding his girlfriend for whatever reason and investigating this kid, and then Steve keeps being like, oh, I should probably go after Danny, and then their girlfriends spend the whole weekend together, and the two of them spend their whole weekend together.
And then at the end of that episode, they're having a romantic dinner on the beach, but they're both sitting across from their girlfriend.
Yeah, the women sit on one side, they sit on the other side. Steve has his arm around Danny, as he always does.
And he's stroking his neck.
Yes, he's stroking his neck and ear, and you're like, why is this so intimate? So yes, dates. In a similar vein, in my Meet the Family section, every time one of their relatives appears on the island, they make pains to introduce that person to the other one. So like Danny's sister comes to town and Danny introduces her to Steve, but he does not introduce her to his girlfriend at the time or any of the other people from the Five-0. Danny's mom comes to town. He introduces her to Steve, but not to his girlfriend or anybody else. And then in a category, or my final category, I'm calling Uncle Steve, which is just about this very close relationship the two of them have, as evidenced by the way that Steve interacts with Danny's first daughter and then eventual children, because there is a son that comes about later. Steve and Danny both coach Grace's, his daughter's, baseball team together. Steve and Danny both go on Grace's Girl Scouts trip as like counselors together. It's another Valentine's Day and Danny gets a text from his girlfriend while he's spending it with Steve. That happens a lot. Anytime one of them has a girlfriend, they're like not really in the show a ton. And so they're always with each other and then being like, oh yeah, my girlfriend texted me or my girlfriend said this. And you're like, you still have a girlfriend? When Charlie, who's the son, the episode is framed around him telling his son a bedtime story. And the bedtime story is about Steve catching this criminal. So you're hearing the case through that. And then it's Christmas, so at the end of the night, Steve just breaks into Danny's house and is there eating his cookies. And there's a Steve stocking with the stockings for the family. Isn't that nice?
That's cute.
And then there's an episode where they're trying to work on Charlie's room, like decorating it in Danny's house, and Danny gets called away to work on a case. So Steve stays and he finishes the room for Charlie. And then when he's like Steve's tucking Charlie into bed at night, and he tells him that it was like all Dano, and Charlie says Dano's the best, and Steve is like, he is the greatest. It's a sweet family moment.
That's very cute.
So that is, again, a non-comprehensive list of the many McDanno moments of the show. There are tons more. The evidence is overwhelming, but I feel we should move to the finale, the interesting finale, which you can speak more to because you've seen it, as have I. So what are your impressions?
So again, right, for fans of the show and for context, I only watched 10 episodes of the show. So keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But just like structurally as like what a finale should do. And I also understand, right, there was some like question about whether or not the show is continuing.
Yeah, it should be said that when they wrote the finale, they had not been canceled yet, so it was potentially not going to be the series finale. Though I believe they did know that it was going to be Alex O'Loughlin, who is Steve's last episode. So at the very least, it is like was meant to be a farewell for Steve.
I found the finale to be very strange on multiple levels.
Do tell.
Okay. I also understand that Scott Conn was sort of in and out for the last couple of seasons and had fewer episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't quite know what the scheduling issues were, but it would make sense to me that for your finale send off for your main character, and this is another thing we didn't talk about. When I watched the episodes, I asked you, no, in my mind this was a two-hander. But you were saying, no, Scott is really, from the writer's perspective, seemingly the main character, which is fine.
Steve.
Yes, I'm constantly calling Steve Scott.
I knew this was going to be an issue. But yeah, I think maybe in the beginning it was more of a two-hander. But then, yeah, as we said, Scott Conn started to sort of step away from the show. And I think things shifted to be more Steve-focused. And potentially in the mind of the creator, he was like not super happy about Scott Conn stepping away. So questionable things happened with how they handled Danny's character being in and out. But yeah, so I would say by the end, not as much of a two-hander as it started as.
Right, but we've established that Danny is very important in Steve's life. So it would seem to
that
me,
couldn't be more clear.
If I were making predictions about the finale, it would be Danny and Steve having a final hurrah together. Like, they would be solving this case together, which is tied to Steve's mother, which I don't understand everything that's going on with that, but it's not important.
Mm-hmm.
Danny is barely in the finale. Like, he gets kidnapped and very much injured, and there is a sweet moment where, you know, Steve has Danny in the back of the car and he's cradling him, and then when Danny's potentially dying, you know, Steve's like, take me, not him, just don't let him die. So first bit of weirdness for me was Danny is barely in this episode with Steve.
Yeah.
It would seem to me also, again, knowing that Danny is the most important person in Steve's life, that if the ending of the show is that Steve is going to go off and leave the island, which a whole question there, like why you would do that, the final scene would be between him and Danny, right? That would be the emotional send-off.
Yeah, because in your mind and mine, when people are doing, like, saying goodbyes to a bunch of people on television and in real life,
yes,
when you're saying goodbyes to a bunch of people, you sort of get the, like, less important relationships out of the way, and then you build up to what is the most important relationship at the end. They get the final goodbye. What actually happens in the show?
What happens in the show is the goodbye to Danny, who has also been in the hospital and is still like really injured, comes first.
Yeah. So they're on their beach chairs that are their special place with each other. And Steve comes out and Danny's basically like, you finished packing? And Steve's like, yep, on my way out. And they sit and have like a couple minutes of conversation about basically the beats of their conversation are Danny is not happy that Steve is leaving, and he tries to convince him to stay in Hawaii. And Steve's like, you know, just can't do it. Like, gotta go get my head on straight, or whatever his reason for wanting to leave is. And then he says to comfort him, it's not a final goodbye or something. And Danny's like, of course it better not be. Like, why would you even bring that up? And then Steve just sort of awkwardly, like, looks away.
Right.
They hug. Steve walks away from him on this beach chair by himself, injured, with no one to take care of him. Yeah. And he turns back one final time to look at Danny on the chair before he walks into his house.
Yeah, okay. So that should be the end of the episode if we're doing this, right?
Right.
But it's not. Then he goes inside his house and says goodbye to a dog. And I was like, is that your dog? Why can't you take your dog with you wherever you're going? Why are you leaving this dog? That's a huge question I also have about why he had to leave his dog, because I don't understand where he's going.
No one knows.
And I hadn't seen the dog before, so I didn't quite know whose dog it was. But I was like, that better not be your dog, because take your dog with you, guy.
It is his dog, but he's leaving it with Danny. Now Danny, alone with no one to take care of him in his recovery, now has to take care of Steve's dog.
And then everyone from the Five-0 shows up at his front door, and they it's very surreal. They cycle in one by one and say something meaningful to him about, you know, how he changed their life. And so, those are emotional. Some of the actors have been on the show for a very long time. So Shai McBride has been there for a long time. And you're like, yeah, okay, I get it. But still, weird that it comes after his goodbye to Danny.
Yes. We didn't even mention earlier in this episode, you were saying Danny has been portrayed as like very important to Steve. In the episode when Danny is kidnapped, the person who kidnapped him calls Steve and says to him, "We have the person you care most about in the world." That is the framing of the show, that Danny is the most important, the person you care most about in the world to Steve.
Yes. Okay, so he says his goodbyes to the rest of the 5-0. It's weird that happens after he leaves his dog, and then he gets on a plane to go once again somewhere. Apparently, somewhere you can't bring a dog.
Right. I always frame it as his like eat, pray, love trip. That's what I assume he's going to do. He gets a text from Danny that says, "I miss you already," and he smiles at his text from Danny, and then
a woman comes up and she says, "Is this seat taken?" And I'm like, that's not how planes work. This isn't a Southwest flight.
How did she arrange the seat next to him? It doesn't make any sense.
Apparently. So this character is in at least one of the episodes that I did watch, but I did not remember her. And it's Catherine, who, well, I guess we'll talk a little bit about in a second. And the implication is that they're back together. They were together before.
Well, but they're not. The implication is not that they have gotten back together off screen and we just haven't seen it.
But yeah, the implication is they're going to get back together, I guess. They hold hands as the plane is about to take off, and it's like, okay. So, like I said, I have several questions. One, where is he going? Why can't he take his dog? But I also have a theory about...
It's an amazing theory, guys. It's going to bring everything together for you. I've totally adopted it.
The only way this finale makes sense to me, from the way the last scene plays, where she says to him, "Are you ready to go?" And he says yes, and then they hold hands.
Right.
To the surrealness of the way all the members of 5-0 file through his house one by one, and he says his meaningful goodbyes, is he is in a coma. And it's like one of those coma episodes where really what the character needs to do is tell everyone he's not ready to go, and he needs to get back to being alive.
And that's how he would wake up, yeah.
Right. But instead he says yes, and he's dead at the end. When she says, "Are you ready to go?" and he says yes, he's agreeing in his coma episode to die.
To go. And then reading it that way, like, it's so sad because there's that scene with Danny where Danny is like basically saying, "Come back to me, like, don't leave."
Yeah.
But he does.
Yeah.
Steve's dead, guys. You heard it here first.
That's my theory. That's the way that the finale makes sense to me structurally. Otherwise, I'm like, I just have a lot of questions.
So yeah, I'm with you with that theory. That's where we leave the show. That's the end. Steve is just going, presumably not forever, but unclear since you don't know where he's going or really why.
Should we talk a little bit about Catherine more?
I think we should.
Because you really had to explain her to me.
The way I contextualize her is that she kind of is like Steve was before the beginning of the show. So she's very tied to her work. Anytime the Navy calls and wants her to go somewhere, she says, yes. She's immediately on the plane to get out of there. And with little regard to how it affects the people in her life. So there is a period where she works on 5-0, which is how they keep her on the show. But if ever that is not the case, she's just sort of in and out of his life. And then there is a season where all out of the blue, Steve decides that he wants to get married. And I guess when you decide you want to get married, he figures he should ask Catherine, because even though they're like kind of together, it's still pretty tenuous. But before he can ask her to marry him, she gets another assignment and is like, "Peace, see ya." And he never gets to ask. So she appears less and less as the seasons go on. I think she's probably in like one episode of season 9, comes back for a case. Her only episode of season 10 is the finale. And I don't know how much she's mentioned in season 10. I know in the beginning of the finale episode, Steve has a conversation with someone about her. And he calls her like the one that got away, which is interesting because as a viewer of the show, I think at a certain point, fans of the show became pretty tired of their dynamic. I think Alex O'Loughlin, the actor who plays Steve, felt similarly by the end about that storyline and how it had sort of played out. But that said, Peter Lenkov, the showrunner clearly is a fan of her and keeps, like, always wants to bring her back. And from comments he makes later, always envisioned her being who Steve was with in the end of the show. So that does take us into, what do the creators say and do?
Mm-hmm.
As we do, we always start with the actors. So tell me about Alex O'Loughlin and Scott Caan. They say tons about this show all the time, don't they?
So what was a little difficult for us is we definitely found people who said that they said things, but we couldn't find the things that they said. So we don't want to say that they said them definitively, because we can't say that.
Yeah. So neither of them have any sort of like social media, Twitter accounts or whatever, where they're interacting with fans. And Scott Caan actually, by the last few seasons of the show, wasn't even doing like preseason press anymore. So the amount of on the record interview type stuff we have from them is fairly minimal. Anything we're getting from them is from an interview. It's not from them deciding to say something to a fan one time. So we don't get a ton. And as you said, we did find lots of fans that said something to the effect that Scott and Alex had been supportive of the idea of McDanno in the past. Mm-hmm. Whatever that means to you. What I found of them is that they seem pretty chummy in their interviews. They talk about how they hit it off and how they're such close friends and they love each other. You sort of can imagine a world in which someone brings this up to them and they're like, yeah, that's cool. Like,
right. We didn't find anything where they were like, ew, gross. No.
Right.
We just didn't find anything.
And that sort of thing, when that happens, I feel like you know. But again, we could not find the actual quotes of them saying anything positive that people seemed to be referring to. But what we did find is Alex O'Loughlin giving a pretty definitive opinion about the Catherine and Steve relationship. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, after he had almost proposed to her, she comes back when he's dating someone new, and this new person that he's dating, named Lynn, accidentally lets slip to Catherine that Steve had almost proposed to her. I think she sort of assumes that she knew, but she did not. Mm-hmm. And then in the episode, Catherine brings up to Steve that she knows now about the almost proposal, and Steve says to her, like, oh, wow, what would you have said if I had asked? And she says she would have said yes. And then, as I said, she sort of fucks off to parts unknown to go about her. And so they asked Alex O'Loughlin about this because I guess you could get the impression that him even asking what she would have said meant that he thinks they should still be together.
Right.
And so these people say, should fans of Steve's comparatively nascent romance with Lynn interpret his interest in Catherine's hypothetical proposal response as any kind of slight, a red flag? And Alex O'Loughlin says, absolutely not. No fucking way. O'Loughlin makes clear, adding that Catherine is not the one who got away, but the one who was not meant to be. As far as I'm concerned, he was just curious, because for him to get serious with anyone else, really serious, if that's what happens, he needs closure on Catherine. And hearing her answer gives him that closure. He's like, okay, how ironic. I guess this just wasn't in the cards, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the O'Loughlin verdict on the Catherine and Steve relationship from a couple of seasons earlier or whatever, which makes it very interesting that in the finale, the character of Steve calls her the one that got away. When yes. Alex O'Loughlin has literally said the word, she's not the one that got away. But obviously, he's not the writer, and writers have their own opinions about things.
They certainly do. Now, Alex O'Loughlin and Scott Caan might not have social media, but the actress who plays Catherine, Michelle Borth, does. And I think it really is a cautionary tale. And like, maybe if you're famous, you shouldn't have Twitter.
Yeah, man. It's only a problem. It's for her, there are probably certain fan interactions she maybe should not have had. She seems to be, I actually seemed to be. I feel like we did hear she's kind of toned down her Twitter usage in recent years. But at the height of her Twitter usage, she was often finding herself in conflict with fans who potentially did not like her presence on the show. As we have said, there are lots of fans everywhere who, whenever there's a female character on a show where they have a male ship, they do pretty horrendous things to the actress who plays the female character, which obviously we do not support.
Yes, and we don't know the full context. We weren't able to find like a write-up of exactly what went
wish.
Down.
Why didn't anyone write an article about this?
I don't know.
Anyway, she is not one to mince words and has gotten into some pretty intense debates with fans on Twitter. And there was this weird situation that we couldn't make heads or tails of about this woman who was trying to run a fan site, I think about her, but it, like something went
but then
awry.
People said mean things on the fan site, and so she tried to get it shut down, and then she called the person who ran the fan site a heinous bitch.
Which is so funny, and everyone should bring that back. And then things got, I think where the fandom probably soured entirely on her is her getting in a fight with people about their like fan fiction writing. She said, "I'm sorry, reality check. Having a Twitter account and writing, quote, fanfic does not make you a writer. Don't quit your day job. Oh, wait, right." Which is like, you just probably don't want to be getting into arguments with fans about their fan production. Yeah, it's just never a good place to be. But that said, it's not all bad with Michelle Borth. Because somebody said something to her about McDanno and how they secretly ship it. And she replied, "I kind of secretly ship McDanno too. If the show would ever dare to really go there, I'd be the first to champion it." Which,
so that's nice.
You go, Michelle Borth. She's the only person from the entire show that we could find as being on record in favor of McDanno, which is hilarious. Here's where we would normally talk about writers and directors. In our case, that is going to be pretty much exclusively Peter Lenkov, who is the creator and showrunner of Hawaii Five-0. But I think in this episode, we're going to save that for a discussion at the end about fan interactions with the creators of the show. So we will skip right ahead to Archive of Our Own, looking at the fan works. And in our ranking of ship stats, McDanno is the number 45 on the list with about 11,750 fic. Pretty respectable. Yeah. A top 50 ship for a show that's been going forever. So the most kudos fan fiction in their ship is called Love's a Battlefield, parenthetical. And the Navy did not train Steve for this shit, by Cyrus is how I'm going to pronounce their name. Tell me about the fic.
A slightly longer one again. Not super long, but like over 10,000 words. And the fic is essentially Steve wants the rest of the team to get off his back about being single. So he pretends he has a boyfriend named Danny. And he's being forced to go to dinner with Kono's mother, right? And he needs to bring a man named Danny. So he just randomly yells out, he's somewhere in the street, Danny. And a person who perfectly matches the description he gave to his team is like, what?
More and more details about this guy as he goes along, where at first it's like, he's just named Danny. I don't want to tell you anything about him. And then he's like, he's a lot shorter than me. And he's blonde. And he's this. And he's like argumentative. And he just keeps naming all these qualities that are exactly the qualities of Danny. And then, he yells out, Danny.
And this perfect guy shows up. He has manifested Danny into existence. And he basically kidnaps Danny and takes him to this party, and they hit it off immediately, and then they are fucking. And then he gets him to join the 5-0. So it's in some ways quite similar to the pilot in the sense that he like just forces this guy to join his team, and now they're together. But, more romantic and more sexual.
Right. Well, because it's an interesting twist where it's like if you start their relationship in the context of a romantic one, then it all is obvious, even though the beats are the same and their dynamic is the same.
Yeah.
And so you're like, I guess it works. Everybody buys it.
I was trying to think through, right? The other fic we had that was a little bit longer was the Teen Wolf fic, right? Yeah. And obviously the Hannibal one we didn't read because that one was like hundreds of thousands.
No, we read a short one. We didn't read the full 4th season of Hannibal.
Yeah. So we have a few examples of a slightly longer fic being the most kudos. And this one is also more sexual than some of the other ones we've read. So the ones that if I remember correctly, have a sex scene in them are this one, Leverage, James Bond, Hannibal.
Hannibal, yeah.
Is that it?
Off the top of my head.
Okay, somewhere there. So I'm like, I don't know what that all means. I don't know if like those 4 things maybe have an older audience.
That could
generally be. Than some of the other ones that we've done. But yeah, that was my, as I'm if we were trying to work through, like, do we see patterns? This one is, again, a slight deviation from short, fluffy being the most kudos. And again, this is probably, right, a smaller fan base than Marvel. But what is it?
Everything is a smaller fan base than Marvel. But interesting. Yeah, we're developing, we're getting more and more data points for our eventual analysis. But I guess that is it for the fic, and we can move on to what would normally be scholarly work. But I don't have particular scholarly work I want to talk about for this one. What I want to talk about is the idea of partners on television and the inherent romantic tension that comes with that.
Right.
So, like, partners in procedurals.
Yes.
Usually cop partners, but they could be cop adjacent partners too.
Sometimes there's a consultant.
Right. Oftentimes a consultant, or like their PIs or whatever. So this trend is what I will be calling buddy cops to will they, won't they. So back in the day of police procedurals, you almost exclusively had male-male partnerships that were cops because, you know, cops are men. Everybody knows that. And then you did sort of have the occasional, like you had Cagney and Lacey, but again, that was female-female. Then there became this trend of, if you're going to have a procedural with like a two-hander procedural where you need partners, why not make it a man and a woman? How progressive and interesting. But when we had that happen, almost all the time, it became a thing where that man and that woman were probably going to end up together. It was the will they or won't they relationship of the show. And going back to the most, you know, iconic, whatever, relationship like this is Moonlighting. The thing that changed all of television and the way that people write this shit and how people write will they or won't they relationships. That is a procedural will they or won't they. They're private investigators working together, and for the whole length of the show, it's like they're partners. Are they going to get together? Maybe eventually. And then they finally did. And then, you know, the writing got bad or whatever.
Right.
So, since Moonlighting, we've had tons and tons of examples of these male-female partner relationships where they get together. So you got like your Mulder and Scully on X-Files, Booth and Bones on Bones, Castle and Beckett on Castle, even Sean and Jules on Psych, even though I would say that the main relationship of that show is Sean and Gus. Peter and Olivia on Fringe, Jane and Lisbon on The Mentalist. Neither of us have seen The Mentalist.
Nope.
Chuck and Sarah on Chuck. Remington Steele and Laura Holt. Again, haven't seen it, but how are we not going to talk about Remington Steele?
Yeah.
Lucifer and Chloe on Lucifer, more recent example. Jake and Amy on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Just like tons and tons of these situations where you have male-female partners, and the expectation of everyone watching is that the two of them are going to get together.
Right.
We would be remiss if we didn't include the many exceptions that prove the rule.
The many exceptions?
The many.
Okay.
The few exceptions. So you got Benson and Stabler on SVU. Then you have like Sherlock and Joan on Elementary. Harding and Miller on Broadchurch. Yeah, you get into the occasional, like, maybe a man and a woman could be partners and not get together. But it is much more rare that is the case.
Yeah, and we've talked before, right, about like compulsory heteronormativity. And there's this sense, right, if a man and a woman have any kind of tension, it must be sexual tension. And it's like, does it have to be? Whereas the flip side, right, is if a man and a man have tension, it's not sexual.
It's impossible for it to be sexual.
And it's like, does it have to be? And so generally, if a man and a woman are cop partners and they're going to bicker and have tension, the expectation is they're going to end up together. And you can see literally the same or more patterns in a male-male partnership, and the writer can still be like, but this woman who is in and out is endgame. And you're like, is she?
Yeah. So I just found myself thinking a lot about this sort of the special relationship of partners on TV and how people write that, and how we, like, writers at this point have kind of been trained to write partners a certain way. So the dynamic of cop partners or cop adjacent partners is usually, often there's a lot of bickering. Maybe they start not liking each other and end up liking each other. But at a certain point, it becomes the main relationship in the lives of these characters. It is always by the end of the show, the most important relationship they have. They are used to putting their lives in each other's hands. The trust they have with each other is like so intense compared to the trust they have with everyone else. And they spend all of their time together. Like, they're usually spending much more time with each other than any romantic partners the show might have for them. And a part of that is like they're always kind of married to their work, right? Like, and they do a job that takes over their lives, and they're doing that job together. So their relationship takes over their lives. But there are just these qualities that are similar to all of these pairings where it becomes like, I don't know if this is how it is to have a cop partner in real life, but it seems really intense on television. You can't avoid it. They are your family now. That's how it is to have a cop partner.
Right.
And it does make sense when that is how you write them, that the male and female versions at least are going to get together. But then it makes less sense that you have these male or female partners who act the same way towards each other and clearly care about each other more than anyone else in their lives, and spend all their time together and bicker like a married couple and they're never going to get together. And it's like, what separates these things from each other other than it's CBS and they're two dudes?
Right. The thing with Steve and Danny is not only are they together at work intensely, they're choosing to spend a lot of their free time together, which is not always the case in procedurals.
I find it very interesting how, especially as the show goes on, but from pretty early on, we see them outside of work a lot. And when they're outside of work, they're together. They're spending like tons of time together all the time. There's not room in the show for them to have important relationships with anyone else. I mean, they have like the what they call ohana, like family relationship with everyone on Five-0. And they very much are like, we all care about each other like family. We're here for each other, that sort of dynamic. But if they have a person, that person is each other. And whenever there's a romantic interest, it's sort of like, oh, is she still here? Like,
yeah, they're not going on full 5-0 group vacations or full 5-0 therapy retreats.
If they're going to be with someone outside of work, it's going to be each other. And then occasionally they'll all like have dinner together as a team at the end of the day. And then occasionally they have girlfriends. But even when they have girlfriends, usually they're bringing each other into the storylines with the girlfriends, right?
Yeah.
So what's the deal here?
They seem in love to me, but what do I know?
What do you know? What could you know in comparison to Peter Lakoff, showrunner?
So yeah, let's get into Peter Lankoff. I think we do want to preface this section by acknowledging that Peter Lankoff turns out not a cool guy, just generally.
Yeah, just generally, aside from Hawaii Five-0, apparently kind of a monster person. After Hawaii Five-0 ended, it became clear that he was fostering hostile work environments, basically, on all of his shows. So by the end of Hawaii Five-0, he's running Hawaii Five-0, but he also is executive producing MacGyver and Magnum PI. CBS is really like crushing the reboot game. A bunch of reboot shows set in Hawaii that he's in charge of. And it turns out people are not having a good time working on these shows. People allege that it's sort of like a boys' club atmosphere. It's really hard for women to get ahead. He isn't making it a nice place for the people who work on the show. Lucas Till, he's MacGyver, right?
Yeah, he's MacGyver.
Had complained multiple times and took it to a bunch of people at the CBS leadership and HR that he was being harassed by Peter Lankoff, to the point where Peter Lankoff is like body shaming him, and he felt suicidal during the filming of the first season, but he can't get anyone to listen to him about it. And so, suffice it to say, Peter Lankoff gets fired, which was a huge deal because he was like one of the few executive producers on TV to have his own night of shows. It was like he was approaching Dick Wolf levels of success, and he gets ousted, totally like out of his deal at CBS, which was massive news. But it did sort of color the way that people thought about things that had gone down on Hawaii Five-0 earlier in its run, even though this happened after it ended. So another notable moment that involved him and the show is several seasons ago, Daniel Day Kim and Grace Park, who were, I'd call them kind of third and fourth on the call sheet, but you could view the show as like an ensemble of the four of them. Because
yeah, and I think in promoting the show's diversity,
Yes.
they were to a certain extent pitched as this is a co-lead show. We
Right.
have two Asian people of Asian descent as the leads of the show with our two white guys, but it didn't show up in the paycheck.
Exactly. It became evident that they were getting grossly underpaid compared to their white male colleagues, and they asked for pay parity and were met with a resounding no thank you from CBS and the show, and ended up quitting the show. Daniel Day Kim and Grace Park together left the show in like a pretty, I think, cool move. Like, way to stand up for yourselves. But yeah, that takes on its own color once you learn what Peter Lankoff is like. And so just to sum it up, in the article that came out after he got fired, we've got behind the scenes, sources allege Lankoff would routinely talk down to writers, particularly women and people of color. In one incident, he allegedly mocked a disabled fan, and after a writer objected to his behavior, attempted to have her fired. Quote, he isn't racist or sexist or classist singularly. It's all of it. He's anti-woman, anti-POC, anti-gay, and everything you'd expect. But he'd also torture straight white men if he felt like it.
And seemingly he did, poor Lucas Till.
Sounds like a great guy. So that's the general background on Peter Lankoff.
Right. And I also want to say, I think, you know, when we were looking for sources, it was maybe a little more difficult because, like, if you Google anything about Peter Lankoff, it's mostly about his firing at this point.
Right.
So there could be more stuff out there that we just weren't able to, to dig through and find.
So we'll give you basically just like our impressions, the general vibe of how fans talk about him on Tumblr. So it feels like during the show, he engaged in his own little bit of queer baiting. We got a tweet here where he is talking about, maybe we revisit Steve and Dano in 25 years, both of them in their early 70s, retired from Five-0, start a PI firm. Danny has to drive because McGarrett's eyesight is bad, but he still takes over once in a while. Feel free to contribute to the fan fiction, he says. Mm-hmm. So, you know, he does that thing that writers do where they're like, people are talking about this? Please continue talking about it, sort of thing. And he also seems to be pretty online, like very Twitter involved, which always leads to fights with fans. So he's got that going for him. And then when it was announced that the show was going to end, fans started to make it clear that they were worried about what was going to happen in the finale. And we found an actual article called like Hawaii Five-0, McDanno fans are heartbroken and worried about the series finale.
Yeah.
So clearly it was out there. He was getting into interactions with people online. He starts to try to reassure everyone that the ending's going to be great. Everyone's going to be happy. He says, I think the ending will be pleasing to all, but I am certain that some will certainly find something to complain about. And oh boy, did they, because how did fans react to the end of the show?
I think they weren't pleased. I don't know if you put this in the outline, but one of the comments we saw was, pleasing to who? Satan?
I love that. So
it really made us laugh. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's like anything else. Some people were like, I thought it was fine or great, but it seemed like the consensus was Steve would not leave Danny.
Yeah, why would Steve leave Danny? If he needs to go off and like get some travel in or whatever, can they not go together?
And it's this weird space too, where like you mentioned, you know, Lankoff is saying, oh, he's gonna come back, but in a decade, like, why is he saying these intense goodbyes if he's going on a 2-week vacation? You wouldn't do that either. So it's very unclear for the finale, like how indefinite his leaving is and what his plans are.
Yeah. But Peter Lankoff is here to tell us what he thinks you're supposed to get out of the finale and Catherine reappearing at the end. So, yeah, they asked him, was it always the plan to bring Catherine back for the final episode so McGarrett could have hope for his future, which is an interesting framing to that question. And he says, for me, Catherine was not as complicated as other people think she is. I think she's somebody like McGarrett. She's a soldier, and she's always put God and country first. It was not her choice to do some of the things that she did. Some of the things that hurt him were not things that she would have done if it wasn't something that she was asked to do. I think that she's always loved him and he's always loved her. I've always thought from the time the character was introduced that he would end up with her. It was just a matter of when. But I always thought that if you've seen William Goldman's movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, It's Butch and Sundance and Catherine Ross, who played Sundance's lover, at a place. That's how I see the next chapter of their life. It's McGarrett coming back with Catherine and Danny, and it's that sort of triangle, the bromance and the romance, that would take them into their later years. Thoughts on that?
So you and I have both seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, not super recently,
Right.
and we both had the reaction of, there was a lady in
woman?
that movie?
That is not something that stuck with me. The things that stuck with me from Butch and Sundance were, I have to say, Butch and Sundance and their relationship, and how it's like the two of them together at the end, you know?
Right. And we did look up the plot summary because we were like, what's this lady's role in this? And Butch and Sundance end up together. She goes back to America.
Yeah, so they are together for a little while. She's helping them with their train robberies or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they go to South America. At a certain point, she decides that they should just quit their life of crime. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I don't think I will quit my life of crime. And so she leaves and goes back to America. And then they stay together and, you know, go out
Die in a blaze of glory. Yeah.
So it's kind of the opposite of what has happened in this Hawaii Five-0 ending, where he leaves his guy to go off with this woman for uncertain ends. But
yeah, so it's a weird comparison, both because no one remembers the woman from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Sorry, Catherine Ross. And also, they don't end up with the woman.
Right.
They end up together.
But I do find this to be sort of illustrative of Peter Lankoff's whole vibe about the show, where it's like, he's not really getting it. And I don't think he was getting Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid either. If your takeaway from that is like, I love the dynamic between the three of them, what an interesting takeaway. And then if your takeaway from Hawaii Five-0 is, I love the dynamic between Danny and Steve and Catherine, again, what an interesting takeaway.
But the fact that he didn't get it is also a little evident from another quote we found. And he was aware that maybe the fans did not want Catherine to be endgame for Steve. So he says in an interview, and this article's on digitalspy.com, I could have listened to the fans and not brought her back. Look, here's the thing. I know the characters best, in my opinion. I know people will say, well, I watched the show for 248 hours. I know them best. But I write them, so I know them pretty well.
Classic showrunner mistake here.
Yeah.
You're not understanding the dynamic of how this works at all, Peter Lankoff. I do find it to be interesting how often showrunners or writers of a show generally have this idea that, like, they are the end-all be-all answer to everything on the show, when, yeah, sometimes that's the case. Like, say you're writing a limited series or something, and you write all the episodes, and you invented the characters, and you know them better than anyone, sure.
And some shows do seem more tightly controlled than others.
In a case like this, where, yes, he has been on the show since the beginning, which is a rarity, and in how, like, broadcast television works. Still, we looked up, like, there are 240 episodes of this show. Mm-hmm. He wrote 33 of them. Now, I'm sure, obviously, he's reading all the episodes and watching them and, like, probably doing his own pass on some of these episodes written by other writers. But tell me how much you think Peter Lankoff sits in his free time and thinks about what happened in season 2 of Hawaii Five-0 between these characters.
Right. So that's the thing he says too, right? He says the fans say, oh, I watched the show for 248 hours, which is maybe approximately the runtime of all the episodes. But I think a real fan has watched the show for much longer because they're probably rewatching episodes and talking with people about the episodes and thinking about the episodes and really digging into the character of Danny. And again, like, obviously, I don't know. I haven't talked to every showrunner, but I don't get the impression that people who make TV go back and rewatch their own stuff constantly, because also that would be weird.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They shouldn't. A showrunner should not feel as passionately about their show as the fans do, because it's not your job. It's your freaking job to make the show, but it's a job, right? You don't go home from your job and then spend your evening going on Tumblr and looking at GIF sets of the actors from your show that you make, because it just doesn't make any sense. That's not the dynamic of people who make a TV show. They shouldn't care about it the same way as the fans, because they're not fans. But they also, I find, often lack the like understanding of what it is like to be a fan of a show. And you think, have you never been a fan of anything in your life? Because why do you think that these fans don't know just as much or more about the show than you do? I promise you they're putting in the work. They're thinking about it in all of their free time in a way where you are putting it out of mind, as well you should be. And I think if you could just grasp the idea that like fans are probably getting something out of the show that you are not,
Right.
and acknowledge that like maybe they know these characters really well. That's not to say they get to make the decisions about what happens on the show. Obviously,
Sure.
that's not the case. But I just find it so interesting when a writer is like, I know them best because I write them. And it's like, well, you write 1 out of every 10 episodes and you immediately stop thinking about it as soon as you go home for the day.
Yeah.
Can we just accept that, like, people who are fans of the show might know more about it than you think they do?
I don't know if we want to say anything to wrap up our discussion of Peter Lankoff.
Well, my wrap up is like, he seems like a jerk.
Yeah.
Just generally. Also, I guess I didn't say, I think it's very interesting that he has this whole I know the characters better than anyone thing. And Alex O'Loughlin, who you imagine also knows the characters just as well as Peter Lankoff, if not better, since he is the character, has said the actual opposite thing of him. Like, in his mind, Catherine and Steve should not be together. That relationship has sailed. And, like, why do we not give his opinion just as much weight as Peter Lankoff's opinion?
Yeah. But it seems like he was aware that maybe Catherine is not where he wanted the fans to end up, but he did it anyway because he's obsessed with Catherine Ross from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or something. I don't really know.
Maybe. Who's to say?
Okay, let's ask their question.
Okay, so is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon, in your opinion?
I think it's queer baiting. We have that little bit of, him talking about fanfic, and it's a little unclear how much fans pressed him about McDanno as a romantic pairing specifically, but there's just so much evidence in the show. They're written so romantically.
Yeah,
and
they're married, man.
There doesn't seem to be any attempt to maybe ramp it down once they find out that the fans are really shipping them and they don't want them to be read that way. It just keeps ramping up. It's ramping up, and then just strangely undercut in the finale. So I'm willing to go with queer baiting. Maddie?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that will become even clearer when we do our gender swap test. So if we gender swap these characters, would they be a couple? I guess we always have the who are we gender swapping question.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about with the Catherine Steve dynamic is I can also see if Steve is a woman, that this like man is coming in and out of her life, and that could really also play as the one who got away, right? As like, sure. Oh, he's a little he's a little emotionally unavailable, and he's married to his job, but we have all this chemistry, da 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 da.
Yeah, that dynamic definitely does make sense. All right. Well, gender swap Steve and Catherine.
Okay.
And leave Danny how he is. I think that's actually kind of fun, because then you got this cool, like, Navy SEAL lady who's in charge of task force.
And is she still taller than Danny?
Yes. It wouldn't be that hard. I mean, Danny's still Scott Conn, and he's not tall.
He's a tiny man.
That is cute. I like it. But yeah, I mean, the answer to this question has to be yes, they would be a couple, because did I not just list every show where a male-female cop partnership ends in romance?
Right.
It always happens that way.
More likely than not, this is not a Stabler-Benson situation, because I think, it's going to be that whole other list of people we named.
So yeah, it's clear to me. I have a hypothesis about why it's not canon, and my hypothesis is CBS.
And also, Peter Lankoff is obsessed with Catherine.
Right, Peter Lankoff is obsessed with Catherine. I mean, it also always underlying our hypothesis about why something's not canon is just like general heteronormativity and the way that people assume characters are straight unless named otherwise. And so, I always say, who's to say if the writers would even have thought of it? When a show runs for 10 seasons and everyone's telling you that they're shipping your characters, obviously you've thought of it. So then
Yes.
at a certain point, it becomes a decision. But yeah, this for this audience, like, I assume most of the viewers of Hawaii Five-0 are not the people on Tumblr who are writing fanfiction about McDanno. I assume they're mostly whoever you imagine normally watches CBS procedurals. But that said, do you have any other hypotheses?
No, I mean, I think that's it. I think it's the heteronormativity and the CBS, and Peter Lankoff is obsessed with Catherine for some reason and wants it to be like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in his memory of it.
What a fascinating guy. So how do we feel about this queer baiting on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being, I don't even know what the fans are talking about, and 5 being unrepentant, malicious queer baiting?
So there's so much evidence, but we also just don't have a lot from anyone talking about it. So it's this like kind of weird space. And I think emotionally I'm inclined to rate it higher just because Peter Lankoff sucks. So.
Yeah. Whenever the showrunner is just like a garbage human, you always want to amp it up a little bit.
Right. So I'm not sure that's like strictly speaking like fair to this discussion, but it's certainly not a like, oh, I don't know what these fans are talking about. That's not right. But I don't know. It's like a 3.5, maybe.
Yeah. I think I'm probably at like a 4 just because of the tonnage of the evidence. Like, these characters could not be more married on screen. And so if you were watching it in a vacuum outside of the assumptions about like queer baiting and heteronormativity and all of that, like, I feel like that end where somebody else shows up and they get together would be like quite the head scratcher.
Right.
Especially when you spend the entire last episode about like how much he loves Danny and how he's the most important person in his life. And then,
yeah, as much as that dynamic I mentioned of, you know, if Catherine was a man and he was this emotionally aloof person, if you have the whole show with Catherine or with female Steve and Danny having that relationship, and then she's, you know, they're living together. They have this
I don't think we even talked about that. Like, by the end of the show, Danny has moved in with Steve just because he's like worried about him. And so he pretends that his apartment is damaged and he needs to move in. And then he ends up just staying.
Yeah, they're living together. They're going to couples retreats. And then she just leaves to be with another man. You would be like, what is... People would be throwing hands.
Yeah, that would be wild. Any movement on your affection for fan fiction this week?
I don't think so. Yeah, this was an interesting read though. The fact that it was like basically the show, but they have sex, and I was like, that's cool.
You're like, it makes sense. It makes the show even more clear. Yeah. So it was informative for you. What are we talking about next time on Let the Boys
We're talking about my favorite thing, Star Trek. I'm so excited. I love talking about Star Trek.
The original / ship. It's finally happening, people. And I have seen almost no Star Trek in my life, so I'm about to go on my journey to Star Trek knowledge, and then I will come back to you with whatever I have learned.
Yeah, we'll be focusing in on the original series, Spock and Kirk, the OG. So much stuff around them. I'm really excited. I love Star Trek so much.
I'm excited too. This is going to be great. And it's the first time we've done a thing where you get to give me a viewer guide, so I'm pretty psyched about that.
Yeah.
In the meantime, until we come back with that one, if you want to continue the conversation, any thoughts for us, anything we got wrong, anything we got right, any mean things you want to say about Peter Lankoff, I don't know, reach out to us at ltbkpod@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter and Tumblr at ltbkpod. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do tell a friend to listen to it. We are always looking for new listeners. New episodes of the pod come out every other week at 6 p.m. Eastern, wherever you get your podcasts.